Hello, my name is Ilan Stavans, and this is the Point-Counterpoint series at Amherst College. It is a pleasure to see you virtually and to have you in the fifth of six installments of this semester's iteration devoted to the intersection of politics and poetry. The Point-Counterpoint series started just after the 2016 election, when it became clear to many of us in higher education that the nation was moving in one direction and that what was happening inside campus walls was not quite synchronized, as if we were living in a silo. And we were not listening but to our own voice, the echoes of our voice, allergic to those that had and have a different political viewpoint. It came to the fore, the idea from alumni and students and faculty and administrators that it was high time to devote a space to understanding how the two sides of the ideological divide think, how they relate or don't relate to one another, and to do so by bringing distinguished personalities to campus when it was possible in person, now virtually, in order to understand how their minds work. One possibility was to bring two of them from each of the sides, left and right, to talk to one another, but that often results in talking at each other. And my own strategy was to bring one single individual and try to follow the path, the map of how her or his mind travails and forms thought. This year, we have had a number of distinguished guests. We started with David Brooks of the New York Times, the Pulitzer Prize winning poet, Jericho Brown. We had Joy Harjo, the US Poet Laureate. We had also a dialogue between John F. Kennedy, President Kennedy, a biographer, Fred Loggevold, and a biographer of Robert Frost, Jay Perini, talking about how the poet and the president related to one another. I will present my distinguished guest in a second, but I want to remind everybody that the last of the series will take place on Thursday, April 29 at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard here again, and it will be with Martin Barron, the just retired editor of the Washington Post, who also was the head of the Miami Herald and of the Boston Globe, where his team won a Pulitzer Prize for the work that they had done to research and expose the connection between the abuses of the Catholic Church and sexual, taking the abuses of the sexual abuses of the entire young populations long time ago. This event, as all events in the series, is made possible by the Seminars on Opposing Views Fund, established by the members of the class of 1970, with continuing support from individual alumni and parents. And it is my honor, really, to introduce John McWhorter today. John McWhorter teaches at Columbia University. He is the host of Slate's Lexicon Valley podcast, and is a contributing editor to The Atlantic. He is the author of over 20 books, including The Power of Babel, A Natural History of Language, 2001, and Our Magnificent Bastard Tongue, The Untold History of English, 2008. And today we are going to, I hope, be talking about his latest book, about to be released, if I get it right, 9 Nasty Words, 2021. I should say before we begin that because of the nature of the conversation that we're about to have, we will study, we will engage, we will discuss profane terms, slurs, nasty words, as John calls them, and that discussion is done in the spirit of analysis and engagement, and certainly not in the spirit of offending anybody. John and I happen to be relatives, married into the same family, the Sparks family, and yet, and we have devoted our lives to words, and yet this is the first time we actually meet next to each other. I have been a devoted reader of you, John, for many years, and it's really a pleasure. John, I want to start with your definition of what profane or nasty words are. In your book, you say that nasty words are less real than regular words, but maybe realer than them as well, and that they don't quite come from the same part of the brain. They don't express the same type of a meaning that regular words, so to speak, do. So what is exactly the definition of profane or nasty or offensive language in Europe?
Well, I would say especially, I should also say, Ilan, that I teach your Spanglish book in one of my seminars, and it's always great for a discussion. My students love that work. But on profanity, I think that for the purposes of Nine Nasty Words, my point is that there are what we think of as words that are really eruptions. They're really gestures. They're generated from the right side, i.e. the emotional and more impulsive side of the brain, rather than the left side, which is where we actually put sentences together and write things for the Wall Street Journal or something like that, not to mention read things in the Wall Street Journal. And so profanity are things that begin as words, they begin as regular language, but they make a trip across the corpus callosum, that link between the left and the right half of the brain, into becoming more gestures than labels for anything, which is part of why often profanity makes no grammatical sense. If you say something like, "What the hell is that?" How would you parse "the hell" in a sentence like that? Or you can use other words than hell in exactly that slot that make no logical sense whatsoever. It's because you're erupting somewhat. They don't have to make grammatical sense, partly because you're really just chirping rather than putting things in a way. So that's what profanity is, and that can be either our bad words, or these days especially, it is what we classify as slurs, but are which really in the same family.
Do you think, John, you've been a student and a scholar of different languages, but mostly of the English language? Is the role of profanity in every language the same, or would you say the English language or each of these languages has a different approach or a different disposition through languages? And I say this because as a speaker of more than one language, sometimes, and as a non-native speaker of Spanish, sometimes when I get angry, it is easier for me to say a slur in my original language, say Yiddish or Spanish, than say it in English, though I know that saying it in English would be more effective because my listeners would know much more what it is. But if it's coming so instinctually from me, it comes from a place that I can't quite control. So comparing languages in profanity.
Well, it's interesting. There is a way of being what we could call profane in any language. The issue is, what do you do when you erupt and say something that you're not supposed to say? How do you transgress the boundaries of linguistic etiquette? The only question is what stable those words are going to come from. So in English, at various times, it's either been religious words or scatological words, or today, profanity is injuring groups of people. Those are all different ways of doing it. Some languages are more colorful than others. Some languages make more use of this thing called profanity than others. In some languages, the way that you transgress in that way is just to say something in a really mean way. And so, for example, Japanese, quote unquote, doesn't have profanity. But when you call somebody a fool in Japanese, it's coming out of the right brain, and it's considered a really mean thing to say. So it's not a word like, for example, shit. It's not the N word, but that's their version of doing what we do when we use what we consider our bad words. So profanity is human.
When profanity is human, and profanity is also a kind of a dirt that gets aired out, and the establishment, the adults, the teachers are always battling it and combating it. The teacher to a third grader says, "Don't ever use those words again," or the parent says to the daughter, "Those words are not allowed in this space." But those words cannot be exiled from our vocabulary either. They are in the proverbial story, John, of, say, a child like a Lord of the Flies or Mowgli in the Jungle Book, a child that is raised in an island without adult impact, and there's another child there that interacts, really a kind of lab scientific image here. Would eventually profanities emerge in the way they relate to one another, even though they were not trained to use a language that is established somewhere else? Is that what you mean by human?
Yeah, and that's a very interesting thought experiment. And in a Lord of the Flies situation, or even some real life ones, you can see that no one is teaching these kids to use profanity as little as possible, because that's what we're doing. When you tell a child, you may not use that word, and they listen to you using it now and then, what you're really teaching them, whether you know it or not, is as you get older, you will use this word, but you'll use it with caution. You'll only use it in extreme situations. Now, of course, with a hypothetical group of kids, maybe they're never taught that. And so they're going to use those words practically as punctuation. But there will be other things among them that will emerge, which are supposed to be treated as strong liquor that you only use if you're, going to expect to get hurt or start a fight. They're places that you just don't go. So FUCK might, with people like that, be practically a comma. But there'll be other things that you certainly better not say, which they probably don't classify as profanity because they won't use that label. But that's what it is.
But in your argument, or in your theory, John, that it comes from the right side of the brain, and that these words don't mean, the fuck does not mean to fornicate. Fuck can be a comma, can be some, whatever it is that in the sentence it's going to imply. Why don't we use instead some strong sound or guttural sound, animalistic sound? Why is it that we choose these particular words and extract them of whatever meaning that they have and insert them in the sentence to not mean what in that sentence they are going to mean?
Well, it's funny because what happens is that something that begins as a word essentially does become sound. If you say, what the fuck is going on here? And you even make it briefer and say, fuck is that? Or people are now beginning to spell it in jest as DAFUQ. So fuck is that? Basically, you have lost all lexical content. And in a way, it is kind of a grunt. And what's actually interesting is that in English, curse words that really get around tend to be ones that start and end with a crisp consonant. There's a part of us that wants it to be something like or those are the ones. And so, for example,
because of that guttural aspirate.
Yeah, and so we subconsciously prefer those as our curse sounds. And it gets to the point where maybe there's a vowel hanging between the two sounds somehow, but we might as well be, doing a Bronx cheer or doing something with our hand. Yeah, that's what they become.
Is there a difference, John, because you are not only a linguist, but a sociolinguist or a cultural linguist? You like to see language in a large cultural context. Is there a difference when we're going to go to issues of race and ethnicity and immigration? But I'd like to ask you about the difference between males and females, of a gender difference between in the use of slurs or offensive language. At a time when we seek and look for equality of representation and certainly equality of language, there used to be a time prior to the 60s where women would be expected to use a more formal or polite, but that has changed. The 60s dramatically changed that. Is there still in any way a strategy to distinguish between how men and when men use this profane language and when women do?
Yeah, which is that there is a very strong tendency in societies for men to be more comfortable with non-standard and even stigmatized language than women. And that doesn't mean that men don't ever speak properly or that women are never improper, but there's a general association, for better or for worse, with between femininity and not being excessively vulgar in speech. That was much more rigorously policed before exactly the 60s. These things are more porous now, and you could do a study of, say, young men and women where you would find a relatively small difference between how much men and women curse. But nevertheless, there still is a difference, and it's because we tend to think of women as speaking more properly, so to speak. And the truth is that data, science actually bears out that we subconsciously often live up to that tendency. Yeah.
And though we only have written language that includes profanities from a certain point on, so to speak, and we can say that the word fuck dates back maybe to the 1500s and it's included in dictionaries at a particular time in history. And slurs probably, and I want to bring you into this, have more of a presence in oral language than in written language. I wonder if there is also a way scientifically to study the difference between how people used slurs, say 1,000 years ago and 500 years ago and 50 years ago and in the present. Are we increasing the use of these words because we're more permissive, we engage with others in a more relaxed way, or is this just a perception?
Yeah, it's difficult because until relatively recently, writing was associated with formality. And so how people actually spoke when they were letting their hair down, so to speak, only pops up in writing in most sources now and then. You have to look carefully. Or you hear people describing how people talked without actually writing down what they were saying because it was considered so improper. And so what that means is that it can be tough to know exactly how profane somebody typically was of a certain social class in, say, 1450, because it wasn't something that you wrote down. What you get, though, are things like this. A bridge is being built in St. Louis, talk about the Sparkses. It's the Eads Bridge. And Washington Roebling was involved with it, and he writes to his wife while he's involved with it that the men are erupting with a lot of oaths as they build this bridge. Now, we don't know what oaths they were, but these were working class guys who talked like normal people. And so they would have been cussing, but nobody would have written down what they said. Or if they started to, they would have very carefully euphemized anything that would be considered improper for proper eyes, especially women's eyes, the idea being that women are readers. So it can be a detective story to know what profanity was like before. And that's a lot of what Nine Nasty Words is about, showing how you can find all these words peeking out from behind the propriety if you know where to look.
And likewise, I'm interested, John, and you say some in this regard as well in Nine Nasty Words, the difference in terms of class and the use of curses and profanity. Not only the frequency with which the working class or the aristocracy might or might not use nasty words, but the type of words that each of these groups do. And just a parenthesis here, it used to be that literature would come, and I'm here not talking about language itself, but literature, from a particular class of learned men in the Middle Ages or in the Renaissance. There is a democratization of literature that happens after the Enlightenment, and eventually literature mostly comes from the middle class. In fact, it is the angst of being in the middle, neither here nor there, that propels the novel and the short story and the poem to be able to express that nervousness of what modern literature is. So I wonder if the cursing of the poor and the cursing of the rich vary according to class, but according to the time in which they are as well.
It's just so hard to tell because a lot of the literature that would depict that sort of thing just very quietly leaves that sort of thing out. And so you can look at a novel like there is L'Assommoir which is this is French, it's Victor Hugo. And he is it Hugo or is it Balzac? I don't remember. It's been a long day, but it is a novel where poor people curse a lot. And that was considered a little bit louche at the time, but it seems there that most of it is going on among poor people. But was that a stereotype? Or my to say something pretentious just once today, I just finished War and Peace. And it's got rich people, it's got soldiers rolling around in the dirt. Nobody ever curses. Now, this is Russia in particular. People were cursing, but Tolstoy in his day would not have inserted that because it would have been considered extremely improper. So it's hard to tell, one, how much people cursed in general, and then to see the class differences is impossible because even Tolstoy, with all of his honesty, sanitized the language in that regard.
Yeah. Now, you in the book, you say, and you just said it a few minutes ago, that you have been able to typify or catalog or establish three different types of profane language: the language that is against the church or against religion in particular, the language that connects with the body, and then the language today that speaks badly of other people. This parallel is also, if I understand well from the book, is a historical development. We used to curse much more connected with God and the church. Then it went to the body, and that now it goes to other people. How do you explain this particular development? The body is as important as it has ever been, and we never cease to ponder if there's a God and the hierarchy of the religious institutions.
Yeah, it's not that we use the religious curses less, it's that they've stopped being considered curses. So we say, oh my God, and OMG, and don't think about it twice. But it used to be that to say, oh my God, if it wasn't about something really important, was considered to be taking the Lord's name in vain. You're swearing vainly, idly, and therefore trivializing the importance of God. And so it used to be that to do that was considered a terrible thing, but there are people talking about how it's done too often. And so it's not as if it didn't happen. And that was because this was a time when basic religious belief, especially Christian belief in Europe, wasn't even considered religious. It was just basic thought. This was considered something that you did not push too hard against in public places. Then, once you have the rise of bourgeois respectability and new senses of what privacy is, then the time in English where you could use words for the scatological, words for sex, words for excretion, with not complete abandon, but with a certain casualness, that ends. And that's why today you have things like something called a restroom. The idea being that you're going to call it a place where you repose, because even water closet in America was considered too vulgar because what kind of water are we talking about and what's it for? And so that is part of the development of society from that stage of fetishizing religious issues to fetishizing issues of propriety and privacy and thinking of the flesh as a terrible thing. And then we move on from that. In these marvelous 1960s, we learn to let it all hang out. We get over this taboo sense about the body. We talk more freely of excretion. A person casually says in a living room setting, I'm going to go pee. That would have been unheard of in 1955. Now you don't even flinch. But today we do fetishize something else. And I'm not saying this is a bad thing, but the thing that we really worry about is slurring groups of people. And as a result, our take today on words like the N-word, or a really hideous word I could use for women that begins with C, our sense of those is very similar to the sense that people had a very long time ago about damn and hell, or when fuck and shit were genuinely profane words, which basically almost no one now is old enough to truly remember. So these things change in society. There's always profanity. The question is just, what are people profane about?
And because we are in the middle of a conversation about the nature, the composition of our culture and our society, who's in and who's not in, do you see these curse words? Do you see these profanities as a form of anxiety that could be read as a statement of that nervousness of how we're conforming ourselves?
Very much. I think that an unbiased anthropologist who looked at our historical progression in terms of what we consider profanity and what was going on in society would see that we are at a point of serious anxiety about issues of race in particular, not to mention sexism. And as such, I think that the societal nervousness about the N-word, for example, has increased even since the 1990s. So in 1990, you didn't run around using the N-word casually, but it's only been since about the year 2000 that we now are no longer to use the N-word even to refer to it, where it's becoming really a taboo linguistic totem. And the reason for that is because of our anxieties about issues of race and perhaps the sense that they never seem to resolve themselves. So these things do chart with social history.
There used to be a time, John, and I think you mentioned, or tangentially you mentioned, where these words were not allowed, and I remember my first exposures to dictionaries as places where I could, when I was an adolescent, as places where I could discover certain sexual aspects of words when I opened and looked for the definition, and that the dictionaries would have these words was a kind of revelation. But the word fog is a word that the English language dictionaries left out consistently until the very end of the 60s. The criteria being that this is not proper for a dictionary to include. And of course, it was, every dictionary creates its own double. Every word that is in and every word that is left out. And the hope is that all the words that are left in as a total will be far more attractive than everything that was left out. But everybody knew that those words were being left out. Now those words are in. And in magazines like The New Yorker, also you couldn't say the word fuck, and now the word fuck can appear. But one of the arguments used to be that if you give permission to these words to exist, particularly in written form, they will lose their power. They will lose their allure. That nasty words are nasty because they are forbidden. And once they are not forbidden, they will, at least those words, disappear, being replaced by something else. But that's not the case, right?
No, I would say that if these words are being used more, what happens is that they lose their power and they stop being profane. It's not that the whole society jumps upon them and starts using them and abusing and hurting people. It's really that it becomes a word that no longer is profane. The New Yorker is interesting because now you can see judicious but frequent uses of the grand old four-letter words that Mr. Sean would never have allowed. And what that means is not that people are cursing in the New Yorker, it means that those words aren't curses. Whereas in that same magazine, it's at the point where I would be very surprised to see Nigger spelled out, even from a Black author, even from the past. And that's because of the totemic status of that word now. If people started using that word more, it would either be because it has a completely different meaning, as it does among especially Black people who use it to mean buddy, or it would mean if a relatively large body of people were comfortable using it in print again, it would mean that we had moved on to other things being words of genuine power. It wouldn't mean that we were reverting to a time when people could use it the way Southern segregationists used it.
I can't think, John, of another word in the English language that has such a taboo as the N-word. In fact, the moment for a reader like me of your book, The 9 Nasty Words, it is upon arriving to that chapter on the N-word, would you even apologize and say, I am a bit uncomfortable on top. I don't know if you put it exactly in those terms, but along those lines, because this word has a particular aura or power about it. There's no other word like that, right? No other word that is really important.
And the reason is because that is what we're really hung up on these days, race issues. That word's equivalent used to be fuck. And it's almost hard to imagine it now, but 100 years ago, you would whisper it. Maxwell Perkins, he's Hemingway and Fitzgerald's editor, couldn't say it. He would write it on the calendar on his desk and show it to people if he needed to indicate what word he meant. And he was a perfectly normal person and he wasn't that much of a prude. That was the word. and it was discussed as the most potent word. It's not an accident that now it is one that's not about having sex, but about race. And you're right, it's very potent, as in, not only do I have that apologetic paragraph at the head of that chapter in the book, but I recently read for the audiobook for it. And I realized that even though I'm the author, even though I'm Black, I thought I can't read this and use the word as many times as I wrote it. Writing is relatively cool. My actual voice in someone's ear is going to be, in the McLuhan-esque sense, hotter. And so I judiciously, as I read it, left the word out or said the N word much more than I did in that chapter, because I realized in our times, whether it makes sense or not, me saying that over and over and over again is going to grate on many people's ears. And that in the interest of making this book a jolly experience, even in this chapter, I've got to pull back on it. And that means that, yeah, it's taboo. I would have felt that way about reading for an audiobook in 1925, if there was a such thing, with the word fuck. Now I'm comfortable saying that here, nobody's even jumping, as opposed to the other one where, notice, I'm not even saying it.
Two reactions to this, John. The first one is that the N word, like other words that are connected with a particular racial or ethnic group, have a different connotation and a different type of circulation. A Black person can use the N word in a way that I couldn't use the N word among Blacks. But you, in reading the chapter that you wrote, couldn't use it, if I'm getting it right, is because your audience is not necessarily going to be Black. It's going to be of a diverse background. In that, can you use that word differently in that chapter if your audience was all Black?
No, because the way I'm using it in the book is not to mean buddy. Usually, I'm just referring to it in a cold sense. And there are many people who feel that the word just shouldn't be uttered at all, and that includes Black people. So Black people are more comfortable with it when it's meant warmly. But that chapter, although I have to say, because I want people to read the book, the chapter is a lot of fun and I hope engaging. That chapter is using the word clinically. It's just talking about, you know, how it developed and how it's used now and how things are changing. So no, I think of this as the real experiment. I have a snotty voice. You know, I sound like a Disney announcer in 1946. That's part of the problem. I'm imagining a different Black author who has more of what I call a Black scent. Could he read and just use the word over and over? Could she? I suspect that he or she today would not do it either, despite the fact that they would have a warmer sound to their voice, just because that sequence of sounds is now considered taboo, no matter who uses it. So there's some subtle issues here, but that's an interesting question.
But also in that chapter or elsewhere in the book, you talk about people who have in the classroom used the word in order to analyze it and yet have been penalized or almost penalized for using the word. And students went to the administration and they almost lost their job. Would you feel that if you had used that word in a particular way, aside from the protocol, in the discomfort, that your standing as a Columbia professor or as a contributor and editor to The Atlantic or working for Slate could have been put in question because of the reactions that listeners and readers might have?
Only since about last June. I have used the word in classes and I have openly said, yes, I'm taking advantage of the fact that I'm Black. I'll say it once, you know, if I'm trying to talk about it. Well, I even have had jokes. You know, some of the white students have said, see, you can do it because you're Black. And I said, yeah, but that means that I said it. Not now. Something really did happen last summer where I wouldn't try. I would not expect Atlantic to let me write it, probably. I would assume that I would have to euphemize it. I've had to become much more careful about it since. And frankly, I think things have gotten a little performative, because I remember in the 90s using the word in interviews judiciously, where you were only referring to it. White people were allowed to do that too. What's happening these days is that some white people haven't gotten the memo yet. And they think that it's still 1998, where you could refer to the word. That's what happened to Don McNeil at the New York Times. And it's gotten to the point where even referring to the word is considered wrong. I personally think that's overdoing it, mainly because I was already a grown-up at a time when you weren't supposed to wield the word, but within reason. You're not going to say it over and over, but within reason, you could refer to it and nobody batted an eye. I must admit, I'm a little geriatrically cranky and shaking my fist at the new etiquette, but I also live in a society and you have to decide what hill you're going to die on. But yeah, now at this point, I would never say it in class. If this were 5 years ago, I'd be saying it here once or twice, but I think I'd better not.
I know, and you do what happened last June, but what happened last June, John, that changed the climate? I mean, beyond the news, beyond the marches, beyond the political uproar that took place right at the heart of a pandemic and right at the heart of the Trump administration having a particular approach to race and into diversity in the country. What happened culturally last summer that brought us to where we are?
Well, I think that you could say that what happened is that a Black man died in a really grisly way, and that a lot of people decided that the country needed to have a reckoning about systemic racism as opposed to interpersonal racism. And that in itself is fine. But there was a lethal cocktail. One, we had an openly bigoted and incompetent president who had said a lot of really crummy things about race. Then you have a pandemic, and I hate to trivialize it, but a lot of people are tired of being cooped up inside and by themselves, and the weather started to turn. I think the protests were partly a very understandable excuse to be with people and to get out of the house. I honestly believe that the racial reckoning wouldn't have happened if there hadn't been a pandemic. But then another problem was also that, whenever you have a situation like this, there are going to be some people, not the majority, but some people who are motivated as much by a certain tribalist impulse to criticize people as to make change. And so what happens is that something that was being called a kind of woke revolution, which is fine, ended up being led by woke people who were being mean about it. And that's where you get a white professor who says that word one time in reference to it, and people trying to get him, fired, or that actually happening. That is not woke. That's mean wokeness. And I think we've gotten a lot of that. And so that's been the problem. And I think that gets into, say, Laurie Scheck, who is, a writer and intellectual. She's at the New School in New York. And she uses the word because James Baldwin used it.
Right.
And students report her to the authorities. She nearly loses her job and now has, not explicitly because of that, but it's clear that basically they just waited a while and got rid of her for something that no one would have thought of as a problem 10 years ago. So that's why, for example, I will not say that word in public since about last June. And I do think that there's been a punitive streak in this that is not going to look good when historians look back on 2020 and 2021. There's been some excess. That's not to say that the idea of a racial reckoning itself was misguided, but you've always got some people who have other motivations as well.
In the reference there is that the movie based on James Baldwin is called I Am Not Your Negro, but the original state,
what he said,
was using the N-word, and it was changed in the
time. And she wanted to discuss that.
Right.
And so she used the word to start the discussion, referring to the word, and lost her job. That's not just. That's not just.
Is woke culture a retro movement that instead of enabling us to openly discuss certain topics has actually blocked the freedom to engage, to do so?
Well, yeah, unfortunately, because I think our tacit rule is that people are to be forbidden from uttering certain things. And I saw an interesting cartoon by Sign Wilkinson today that really just nails what the problem with this is. What this does is it puts tape over people's mouths. And then the person stands there and says, I fixed it. But the thing is, the tape doesn't really prevent the person from thinking it, and it doesn't really prevent the person from saying it. And tape gets old and peels off. It's not the most effective way of changing a culture. It's that punitive Salem aspect of it. And so what it means is that what you want to do is change thought. And it's easier to accept that, it's easier to suppose that change doesn't happen than to accept that it happens slowly. I think the change was happening. And I think that last summer, some people decided, let's make the change happen faster. But that's a hard thing to do, because if what you do is just tell people, if you say this, we're going to call you names on Twitter and try to destroy your life. Unfortunately, one, it doesn't completely stop people from thinking and saying things, and it builds up a resentment that ends up creating as much strife, if not more, than there was before. So we're in a very difficult place where I think a lot of people genuinely suppose that the idea is to be a kind of cop about these things and to spray for a kind of heresy. And if that worked, maybe you would just have to say that change requires making some people uncomfortable, especially ones in power. I'm not sure this works. And so I'm not sure where we're going to end up going next.
Is the N word in the dictionary, in the OED, or in Merriam-Webster? Do you know? I don't.
It's in Merriam-Webster. I honestly have never. It is in the OED. Yes, it is, and it is in Merriam-Webster. Yes, yeah.
So you've been descriptive up until now, but be prescriptive for a little bit, John. In an ideal 2021 universe, in your view, we should be able to use these words more freely, more casually also, because even by saying the N-word, everybody thinks of the real world, the real word anyhow. Is that where you think that that a more healthy, diverse society should be?
I think, and it's funny, linguists aren't supposed to be prescriptive. The N-word challenges me because I just described, but on this one, because of certain obvious factors, I can't help being a human being. I think we need to go back to the year 2000. Not 1950, not 1970. It's something that's happened recently, where you can't even use it in reference. You can't use it to make a passing joke. That if you even utter that sequence of sound, you're kicked out of the game. And that to me is medieval, or it seems quaint. And I remember all sorts of minor exchanges and scenes where white people could refer to the word in a scholarly sense, where white people could refer to the word to indicate solidarity with Black people in making a kind of joke. And no one even thought about it. I remember, I'm going to say something. I'm going to say this one thing. The year is 1994, and there was a Black woman, very good friend of mine, and a white woman, very good friend of mine. And the Black woman was complaining that she was trying to put together a one-woman show about herself, and it was going to be about various things about herself that didn't happen to have anything to do with race. And she said that, I'm afraid I'm going to put this together and nobody's going to be interested. But if I did put something together when it was all about my pain as a Black woman, then it would sell out. But I don't want to write about that. She said, so I can just imagine if I called it Breast of a Nigger, everybody would. That's what my Black friend said, and nobody thought anything. Now, about a day later, the white woman referred to that conversation, and she just said in passing, maybe you should write Breast of a Nigger woman, and everybody just kind of kept talking. Whoops, she used the word, but it was in reference to what the other person had said the day before. Today, for one, that woman would not say that. Or if she did say it, she would be put in prison. I don't mean literally, but it would be considered a horrible breach of etiquette. At the time, nobody blinked because that was considered to be okay because it was a reference to something that a Black person had said. That was better. I'd like to go back to that because even then you could say the N word if you wanted to. There was a time. I just think that we've overdone it a bit.
No, John, there is a African Black culture in America, there's Latino culture in America. We're in the middle of a big conversation, Asian hate. There's no word, being a Mexican, there's no word in the English language that has the power of the N word, or that is connected with Asian Americans that has the power of the N word. In other words, the taboo doesn't exist, as far as I can see, anywhere else but with Blacks. And this might be because Blacks are the protagonists and connected with the original sin of this country, with slavery, because because Blacks also are the leaders for the rest of us to carry on the change. It happened during the 60s, it happened in Reconstruction. Is that what you see too? I want, there's spick and all these words that could connect with Latinos, and some of us have received those words, but none of these words carries the power of the N word, which makes me think yet again of the centrality of the Black experience in America, even at a time when we want to diversify, expand the menu of who we are.
Black people are considered the ultimate threat. Black people were kept as slaves. There was fear of uprisings. There was possibly, if I were a more profound person, I'd say that there was also probably a certain white guilt about that. That's what James Baldwin would have said. I'm not sure I believe that, but I can't say that it's not true. And so there was that. And so, yes, there's slurs against Latino people. There are slurs against Asians, but they don't have the same sting. They tend to fall out of fashion faster. And you notice that they probably had more power in the past than they do today, whereas there's a lingering sense with the N-word of an incredible power. Although part of it is also that so much of our race issues are about white and Black. And to the extent that certain Black thinkers and leaders insist on treating the N-word as such a powerful thing and agreeing with people, getting fired for, referring to the word and things like that, in a way that helps maintain the word's power. I can imagine a hypothetical America, and this is an unpopular thing for me to say, but I can imagine a hypothetical America where if things hadn't gone so far as they have over about the past generation, the word would be losing its power somewhat out of a sense that it just doesn't make Black people jump as much as it used to. And so, spick, I'll say it. I feel like I'm Archie Bunker, and I get the feeling that kind of just rolls off of a lot of Latino people now. There's a hypothetical America where the N-word could do the same thing. I worry sometimes that some of us, both white and Black, won't let it. And that's a whole other issue.
And you think that Black intellectuals, you're one of them, but there are many others, obviously, could be at the forefront of changing that attitude by being more, less and more engaged with that word?
Yep. There could be a little anthology. It would be a nice book. It would run about 99 pages. You have about 15 leading Black intellectuals making terse statements saying, okay, we're gonna take a deep breath, and we're gonna stop fetishizing this. I think even that, if it were done as an audiobook too, could turn the whole tide around on that.
Yeah. Now, John, I can't also think of a more versatile word in the English language than fuck. Fuck can be a verb, can be a noun, can be an adjective, can be a comma, as you said, can be an exclamation mark. Just talk to us a bit on how incredibly elastic that word is. You can say so many things with it. You could write an entire short story where it is almost the sole word is the protagonist.
It's pretty spectacular. It starts as referring to sex, of course. And then the idea is that because one might associate a certain power relation with sex, it involves maybe deception, so fucking somebody over, or destruction, ruining, fucking something up. Then another thing that happens with that word is that you have expressions with hell. What the hell is that? To hell with that. Where they've gotten weak over time because hell is really not profanity anymore at this point. So you slot fuck into the place. So you have what the fuck is this? That's not Fitzgerald, that's later. And then you have fuck taking the place of hell. And so you have fucks going on here and the like. And then you have, I don't give a damn. That now sounds a little 100 years ago. So you say, I don't give a fuck. Then you have expressions today like, I don't have any more fucks left to give. And so part of it is just that because fuck has been basically sanded down into being a kind of an interjection of sound with no meaning, you can slot it in where older curses no longer have their sting. Mm-hmm. And so that means that there's this word that means to have sex with that's also meaning things like dismissal and adding a bit of Tabasco to a statement, etc. And so you've got this endless usage. It's rather dazzling. 9 nasty words. I think some people are going to think, especially because I'm Black, that I wrote it because I wanted to say some things about the N-word, and then I decided, well, I have to do the other ones too. Not really. I wrote 9 nasty words thinking, I guess I've got to do the N-word too, but
Mhm.
ass and dick and fuck and shit and all the ways that they've permeated the language and become pieces of grammar. That's why I wrote 9 nasty words. I want to share this, but I also have to do the N-word. So I did.
Now, when we say profanities, we are inevitably connecting with a religious or theological aspect here. There's something that is sacred and there's something that is profane. And this connects with the aspect that you were describing before, the curses or slurs connected with religion. I am fascinated with the concept that there can be words that carry within themselves the divine, aspects that bring us outside of our earthly condition. And conversely, words that include the profane, that is, words that are the opposite of the divine. And at the same time, you know, we live at a moment where religion, at least in certain circles, doesn't have the centrality that it used to have a while back. And I'm struck by the fact that we still refer to them as profanities. Profanities mean you're desecrating the sacred, when very few people think of language as sacred, at least in the realm that is outside a temple, a synagogue, a church, a mosque.
Yeah, and that's because what we consider sacred changes, despite the fact that for us, sacred brings to mind a cathedral. So it used to be sacred things, as in Christianity. Then your private parts are sacred, and the procreational act is sacred, and your body is sacred. And now the dignity of subordinated groups is sacred. It's the same thing. And so that's where your attitudes about the quote unquote bad words settle upon. What the society considers sacred, that might be the gods, but it might be any number of other things. And that's how profanity ends up working.
Now, John, young people tend to be more permissive when it comes to language. They also can be much more creative when it comes to language because they are young. And older people are more conservative and mindful of protocol and concerned with the continuity of language, the passing on to the next generation. Does each generation create new curses and slurs, or is the database, the bank of curses, stable?
It's not that each generation creates new curses, and it's not necessarily about generations per se, but as the generations pass, it's inevitable that curse words will be used in new ways, because anything that starts out strong is going to weaken over time. The joke that's really funny now isn't going to be funny next week. The word terrible used to mean terrifying, and now you can talk about terrible meaning that you slipped a little bit while you were going up the steps. That's inevitable, and profanity works in the same way. And so you're always going to have profanity renewing itself in various ways. What the bad word for that is going to be in, say, one century versus the next one, not necessarily generation. And young people are often at the forefront of making changes like these. And so what you see is a gradual change in how you curse. And so, for example, you can look at blooper reels of Hollywood actors in the 30s and the 40s when something goes wrong. And these are people in real life. And if something goes wrong, they have no idea anybody's going to be seeing this, 70 or 80 years later. And what they say when something goes wrong is often it'll be son of a bitch, or they'll say, damn, or they'll say, oh, hell. And, the crew is laughing. That's considered hilarious. Those were curses back then. I have never seen one of those, and I'm a big old movie fan, never seen anybody say fuck. The word existed, but if Betty Davis messes up, she doesn't say, oh, fuck. Whereas today, her equivalent very much would. Cursing was different. People said son of a bitch. If somebody got mad at somebody on the set, a person would say, why, you old son of a bitch? Today, it would be asshole in the same situation, but it's the same feeling. And it's just that son of a bitch got old. And so now you say something that feels more profane. Asshole will certainly be completely replaced by something else in 50 years. I'd be interested to see what it was. So these things happen.
John, we're coming to the end, and I have two questions that I still want to ask you. Both are personal, and not revelatory, but connect all of the discussion with your own life. The place and the role that the curse words have in your daily life with your children, as a parent, for instance, because of all the investment that you have into understanding what these words are. Do you feel that you could use them with your children in a particular way, that you want them to use them in a particular way? How do you use them in your daily life? How does that research transform your own language?
I curse a lot, not the personal slurs, but the ones about religion and the ones about the body. I curse as much as somebody of my age and station would, and probably a little more. I'm quite free with the F word. And more to the point, I am quite free with those words around my children, who are right now 6 and 9, because I think we tend to forget that they quickly internalize a sense that words are bad or words are not. It's not that they're all of a sudden going to start running around using the F word because they heard you use it. And I haven't had any trouble with that with them. However, I joke around with them where I let them use the word playfully when we come up with little vignettes and things like that, for the simple reason that I truly believe that those words are no longer profane in anything but name in the daily usage of the typical American person of whatever walk of life. Our profanity is the N word, and a word you might use for a gay man, and the C word that you hopefully don't use with women. Those are profanity. I don't think they even know those words yet. I don't think they know they exist, because they certainly would never hear them from me or anybody they'd be likely to be around. But I simply cannot go through the motions of hiding fuck, shit, and ass, and words like that from, for example, my 9-year-old, when I know very well, especially given the era we live in, that by the time she's about 14, which is going to be in about 10 minutes, she's going to be using all those words fluently with her friends, and maybe just holding them back a little when she's around me. Why not just let her hear them now, so that at least when she starts using them, she'll know how to use them articulately? I protect her from profanity that is real profanity. And that seems to be working pretty well.
And were these words, the slurs, and maybe even the profanity, your parents, they keep them out from you, from your side? Were they flexible as you are?
No. I grew up in the 70s and 80s, and I remember my mother literally washing my mouth out with Lifebuoy soap when I popped off with a hell once, imitating them. But the idea that I would use that word, you do not have that. Times have changed. And so, for example, if I stub my toe, spontaneously, I said, fuck. I know that if my father stubbed his toe, he would have said shit. My parents didn't, and they had dirty mouths pretty much. They liked their nip, especially on a weekend night. They cursed, but cursing was different. How you did it around your children was different. I don't remember them using fuck much. I think they kept that more to themselves. A lot of shit, though, but things have changed. And so I just figure, why not treat profanity as what it really is? But I can't criticize them for how they were doing it 45 years ago.
And likewise with in class?
Hmm?
Likewise, as a teacher in class, is profanity, or maybe not profanity, but curses, do you want to keep a certain etiquette in the classroom?
I don't.
Yeah.
No, but I think it's regarded as something of an eccentricity. I curse like a pirate in class, partly because I'm trying to reach my students. I don't put on a professorly persona. I just walk in and I be myself. I think they find that funny. However, I would never use the slurs. But yeah, I will use F-U-C-K. I will use S-H-I-T. I don't think that's true of most of my colleagues. But oh yeah, I use it because I don't think those words are profane. I don't feel like observing the propriety.
John, last question, and this has been really extraordinary. I've enjoyed it tremendously. The language of dreams. I wonder if there is something to be said about, I don't know how it is in your case, but in my dreams, I don't hear language. I know that people are communicating and I understand what they're saying. There's also no subtitles in my dream. So I know what they're saying. I can't read it. I understand it, but I don't hear it. But I wonder how the sound presence in your dreams. And I wonder if dreams either include yours or anybody else's, include slurs and curses, and if not, if in dreams we would have an alternative to that. And I'm just before I hear what you have to say, I'm thinking here of a beautiful sentence by Borges, the Argentine writer, who said once that we don't dream of a lion and feel fear. We feel fear and dream of a lion. So I wonder, what propels us to dream, and if in dreams there are moments that could be accentuated with nasty, profane elements as we do in real wake life.
That's funny, Ilan. My dreams are very verbal. They have a full soundtrack, and I'm thinking of specific examples of profanity in them. I think that's part of the fun of my dreams, and maybe that's because I'm a linguist slash obsessed with language and languages. But yeah, I have it. I have it there. It is
And do they have the
part.
same power? Do they offend, or do they stress
They're
something?
fun.
They're
They're sexy. They make the characters in the dream more interesting. Yeah, I have profane dreams. Very much so.
terrific, terrific. Well, it has been a hell of a conversation. I have enjoyed it tremendously. It was about time, members of the same family, that we met in good schmooze,
Yeah.
bringing a Yiddish term here.
And hopefully in a real way sometime soon.
Yes, much appreciated. Be well.
Thank
Gracias.
you, Ilan.